All right. Hi there, everybody. I am just trying to make sure that I have access to both Slack and my school email, and they're both set up over here on my laptop. If you have a question, please ask your question either via Slack or um, via school email, so michael.burke@hcps.org, or you can ask via Slack, and I will answer your questions that you send in there. Have the chat turned off here in the live stream just to, um, at the recommendation of um, the school administration. So I just wanted to make sure you understand how you can access my how you can access me for questions. So don't look for the chat here. I am going to show you a couple different things here about the written report today and talk a little bit more about your expectations for the capstone. So as you can see here, I have the rubric pulled up, which I've shared with you. And in this other tab, I have this little prep document to using something called Notion, which I thought is a pretty cool little program I've been playing around with during the quarantine stuff. But if you look in here today, I'm going to be trying to talk to you about the expectations, how to plan an academic paper, and how to think about your literature review, and how to set up a document in APA format. As far as the grading goes, there's nothing listed here, as you can see, because everything's pass fail right now. So as far as this works, I will be using the rubric and assessing your content so that I can see what you're up to and give you feedback so that you understand this assignment for later. But in the future, you're going to need to basically need to know how to do this. You need to know how to write an APA paper in college. It's one of the things I hear back from most often from seniors is how this works, that they understand how to do APA papers now that their peers don't, and all that MLA stuff kind of is a waste of time for most people because most of their college experience is APA. So let's talk about the rubric here. So let me switch back over to Chrome. And so again, you're not going to get a grade here in the sense that your score is not going to be as good, but I am going to give you feedback on these three different categories, using these three different categories for each of the different assignments. And so the first part is an abstract. So the abstract is something that should include everything about your project in a very zoomed out view. It's a summary of your thing. So if you look at this, it says description of your project is accurately and completely. It addresses the learning experience and the creative process. So you need to tell me a little bit about where you went, what you did, what your field experience was, and what your creative process was, what the innovation was that you made from there. And it's short. It's less than 250 words. You want it to be, like it says here, in between 150 and 250 words. So you don't have to get into the very precise work, saying like on step 38 I did this. You want to tell us in broad strokes what your assignment was and what you did. Think about this in a lot of ways. If you've ever been to the capstone experience in years past, this is kind of what you would say when somebody walks up to you. You're going to say, hi, my name is Mike, and I spent 80 hours working at Bel Air High School, and I found a lot of interesting things about the field of education, and I saw some things where I might be able to help people, and so how I decided to help teachers is to do this. That kind of overview is what we're looking for here with the abstract. It's something that would let people know if they're interested in reading the rest of your paper. So your abstract, make sure you're talking about both elements. Make sure you're talking about not only the capstone, your field experience, but also talk about your time the innovations that you made, what you created because of that experience. And if you need help with the innovation process at this point, it's totally understandable because we really basically didn't have that time in class to work on your innovation a whole lot. Make sure that you use the link that I shared in Google Classroom to schedule an appointment with me, and we can do a Teams meeting or a phone call to talk more about your innovation process and what's going on with that. The next item on the list is the literature review, and this is what I want to spend the bulk of today talking about. The literature review, as I've shared with you in the past, the literature review is not supposed to be an explanation of what your job that you shadowed was. Meaning, don't tell me if you shadowed a nurse, don't say, nurses are very important for the medical infrastructure. Nurses typically have 4-year degrees. That's not really helpful to us in the sense of a literature review. And this might be sounding familiar because we talked about it at the beginning of the year when you submitted your assignments for that, for your proposal. But here in the literature review, please do keep in mind, like we've talked about all year for all our other assignments, that the word literature here means peer-reviewed journals. And they are peer-reviewed journals about the specific problem that you're trying to address, or a specific solution that has been instituted in the past. So for instance, in my literature review here, I might talk to you about, if I was going with a paper about teaching, I wouldn't say for my literature review that teachers typically have a 4-year degree. I would maybe talk about, because my paper is about the gamification of learning, I might talk in my literature review specifically about the 2 Sigma problem by Benjamin Bloom and his paper, and how that paper addresses a certain element about education, like making a mastery style learning or something like that. I don't say teachers are people who help students learn. That's not a great use of your time and space in a paper. So with your literature review, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes once I switch over to the mind map that we're going to look at, be very conscious of the fact that your literature review is peer-reviewed research. Use Google Scholar and find peer-reviewed research, not about a broad topic, but about the specific thing that you're talking about in your paper. I would focus mostly on, here is my innovation. And so my innovation is predicated based on this concept of psychology. So I need to talk about that concept of psychology so that when I explain my innovation later in the rubric, people will understand why that was such a clever thing for me to do. The way I've explained it before, the literature review, is think of it almost kind of like an argument where you're not talking to me like you're writing an English paper about how the color green is such an important color in The Great Gatsby, and that light really, the green light that he was looking at was this. You're not trying to convince me of something like that. So you don't have to take this big, long, arduous explanation. The literature review is this really fast document. Tons of citations are in that document, and you're moving from point to point. You're getting through it as fast as possible. Take all that fluff out of there that you would use for to hit a word count for, again, a literary assignment, and be really focused on, here's the content that somebody needs to know in order to understand why everything else that I did makes so much sense. And the argument part, what I want you to think about here is don't talk about your innovation yet. you should talk about all the different things that your innovation is working with and working on, so that by the time I get to the end of your literature review, I should be able to read it and say, huh, you know what? I think somebody really should do more with gamifying learning. It seems like it'd be really helpful. And then I'm going to read about your innovation, like, oh, yeah, yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's a great idea. So you're setting yourself up to win an argument, kind of, but you don't win the argument in the literature review. You win the argument later in the paper when you tell me about your stuff. The literature review is focused on what is happening, what has already happened in the past, what are people working on right now, what's the problem that everybody's trying to address. And you're trying to make sure that I understand all that, but really focusing on setting your project up to be the answer. So you can think about it that way if it helps you to think in an argumentative type of style of writing, like at least that's how I was taught how to write English papers, was that it's an argument that you're trying to win. The literature review is, in this whole academic paper, kind of is an argument. We're not supposed to think of it like an argument, but it kind of is an argument. And the literature review is the setup for that. And then later, you answer that argument. You win the argument when you start talking to me about the rest of the stuff later on. And so this week, that's what we're going to focus on the most, is the literature review part. The literature review is more than 500 words, and you're talking to me about the pre-existing knowledge in the field. That's what I was talking about before, about saying, like, if you're making an innovation in our class and you're saying, like, this type of joint that I am suggesting after I shadowed an orthopedic surgeon, I'm saying that this is a better way to make replacement shoulder joints, and it's with titanium, and I chose titanium because titanium's non-reactive, blah blah blah. You would put that in your literature review. The biocompatibility of titanium would be in your literature review, and then you're kind of seeding the idea. You're introducing me to that concept, and then later is when you would talk about. So remember that titanium I told you about? Well, I told you about it because this innovation uses titanium. So again, think about the literature review in that context to say, okay, so question here just came in. Sorry to just switch streams there real quick, but you said at the beginning of the year that I could pretty much use my same project proposal for the written report. Does this still apply? Certainly, it can. It depends on how well you did on your literature review in the beginning of the year. If you did a great job with that, really setting up your innovation, and if your project stayed the same, your innovation idea kind of stayed the same, your experience stayed the same, then certainly you can recycle a ton of your proposal, especially in the literature review part. If you didn't find peer-reviewed journals in your proposal in the literature review at the beginning of the year, then you're going to want to sub out any of those literature reviews sources that you had that were not peer-reviewed, and find a peer-reviewed version of that information. And you are going to have to add more information because you've done a lot more work on your innovation. So your literature review is going to have another section or multiple more sections that are going to be highlighting your innovation now that you've done more work about it. So definitely look to reuse, go back to that proposal document and see what work you did there and how, and feel free to reuse that and then expand upon it more. That was a good question. So literature review stuff, again, should be the bulk of what your work is this week, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about structuring that when I switch over here to the written report mind map that I'm going to show you here. The other two elements of this, the experience description and innovation description parts, are what you did. So the first element, let me switch to that camera. The first element is your abstract. Again, that's the summary, the introduction, that's the hook, you might say, to get people interested in what you're going to talk about. Then the literature review is all work that other people have done. The literature review is not your work because your work is not published in journals. So the literature review is the next element up there. And then these two are the work that you did. So the experience description part is kind of a summary of all those journals that you wrote. You don't have to say on hour 36, I folded 4 more towels at my physical therapy shadowing. And then hour 37, I folded 2 more. Like that's, don't tell me about that. Tell me about the interesting things that happened. Tell me about some revelations that you had, really the highlights here. Tell me the most important, interesting parts about your shadowing experience. I have all that other information that you gave me on those day-to-day bases from drawing your journals, but this should be kind of the trailer kind of maybe for your experience. We're thinking about your experience as a movie. Tell me kind of the best parts of that. And again, it's 375 words or more. So that's the work that we want to see there for the experience description. Give me the highlights, the best parts, the best things that you learned, the most interesting things that you learned. And again, or not again, but I would encourage you to make sure that your experience description sets yourself up for your innovation to make a lot of sense. So in your field experience, you might say, I was in a surgery, I was watching the surgery, it was really amazing to see this happen, and then the surgeon knocked over this tray because it was set up on this really top-heavy table, and so that it knocked over really easy. And I thought that was just really didn't make a lot of sense, and that table should be made differently. And so something like that would connect to what your innovation was is good stuff to include in your experience description. The innovation description this is the first time that you're really talking about this in a written format. So your innovation description is kind of going from beginning to end, telling the whole story. And this will definitely be more detailed than your experience description. Again, the experience description is a summary of all those journals you wrote. Your innovation description is where you're going to start telling me about all the rest of the stuff that you're doing, the detailed process that you went through, about the hours that you did working on your innovation. Talk about the problems that you are trying to solve, and the first version that you made, you thought it should be made out of plastic, and then you realized that the plastic had this problem, and so you went back to the drawing board and thought about this thing. Like that type of stuff is what I want to see here. The ups and downs, all the different problems that happened. If you look in the details here, we also do want to see, and I want to take special attention to draw this out, what currently exists to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. So if your innovation is solving the top-heavy surgical table that I just talked about, you're going to have to talk to me a little bit about the top-heavy surgical table, or, and this is an important concept, just because the surgical room you were in had a top-heavy surgical table, that doesn't mean that somebody doesn't sell like the Weeble Wobble version of a surgical table. So you need to have done, and that's what we've talked about this before, you need to make sure that your innovation is actually an innovation. You need to do that research and look out there. And if you do find a Weeble Wobble surgical table, then you need to talk to me about it and say, yeah, I know this exists. This is a thing, but it's a bad idea. And here's why my version of this is better. The other version was made out of, I don't know, rubber, and your version is made out of aluminum. I don't know. But you're going to, and then explain why yours is better. And the legalities part. If that is a thing that's part of your innovation, some people like to do innovations that are I don't want to say about sensitive subjects, but we've had people in the past do innovations related to things like Narcan distribution or something like that. So if if there's a legal concern with your innovation, you need to address it here in the innovation description. It doesn't mean that your innovation is illegal. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if there's concerns about access or something like that, you just need to talk about it in your innovation about how you address them. Another example might be like HIPAA. If your innovation had something to do with patient data, then you're definitely talking about HIPAA, and you need to say, well, the HIPAA stipulations are this, and my innovation addresses them by doing that, and so it all works out. You don't have to dive deep into like Supreme Court rulings or anything like that, but just address the legal concerns that do exist if they exist with your innovation. So here's the part that some people can be confused by. So almost everybody did 80 hours of field experience and 10 hours of innovations. Most of you have one innovation. So you are doing 500 words. Everybody's doing at least one innovation, so everybody is writing at least 500 words. Some people didn't do as many hours in the field, which is totally fine. That's up to you based on that scale that we introduced at the beginning of the year and the goals that you set for yourself. To make sure that there's kind of an equitable amount of work, because all the people who did the field experience had to write all those journals, people who did more innovations are going to have to talk more about their innovations. So what that means is everybody is doing 500 words, and then anybody who did more than one innovation or is hoping to get more than 10 hours for their innovation is writing an additional 125 words for each of those extra 5 hours. So if you did 2 innovations to get 20 hours from your innovations and only did 70 hours of field experience, that means you wrote fewer journals, but will write more here for the innovation description. So it's 500 plus 125 plus 125 for each of the 5 hours. So that means that you're writing 750 words for this section. So the last 2 parts are pretty easy. The conclusion paragraph is a summary. What I would say is different here in your summary, in the conclusion portion, rather than the abstract. Your summary, the conclusion paragraph, certainly would reference what you did in your project, but then what I would probably want to see here from your conclusion would also be like what's different about you because you did this experience, meaning I started doing my field experience in physical therapy, and because I was always interested in physical therapy as an athlete and as somebody who's been through physical therapy, I thought that job was really interesting. So I spent 80 hours in the field learning about physical therapy. I addressed the problems related to patient throughput with my innovation, and I'm really excited to continue learning about physical therapy in the fall because I'm going to the University of Maryland to study kinesiology. That's what I mean by what's different about you now that you've done this experience. And it doesn't have to be a positive story like that, as we've talked about before. It's still good that you did an experience and found out that you didn't like it. So you might take the same experience in physical therapy and say, I thought I wanted to do that. Turns out, no, I definitely don't. So I don't want to do that anymore. I'm going to be studying, business administration in the fall. Totally fine. Either way, you're going to say that in your conclusion paragraph. And lastly, the formatting of the references part is, your typical stuff here. Everything is using APA in-text citations whenever possible. So a ton of those are going to be in your literature review, but you might have others in other parts, like your innovation description probably would definitely have some in-text citations. And everything about it is APA style guide. So that means Times New Roman, 12-point font, double spaced, all that type of stuff. We're going to talk more about that in a second, but for right now, I'm going to shift over here and show you this Mindmap software here that I have. I'm going to suggest that you think about this, doing this step. You don't have to turn into Mindmap to me or anything like that, but I think it is very, very helpful, more helpful than I would choose to care to admit, that doing this process is very beneficial. It's a bad idea for you just to sit and start typing your paper. Planning it out is worth the time. So with this software, I have the Mindmap. This is called MindNode. It's a iOS and Mac software. You can use Kaggle.it, or you can just do it on a piece of paper. But a good plan is to take all of the elements from the rubric and make them into nodes on your map. And it's just going to put them everywhere, which is fine. So I'm taking all those rubric items, except for the formatting and references part, because that's not really content to write. And I'm writing that all out. And if you're doing that in the logical order here, instead of just the randomness that it put in there, it looks like that. Abstract doesn't really have another level to it, which is fine because it's just a summary. Neither does a conclusion. But these middle three, this is where you get the benefit of doing the mapping. All of these would be level 1 headers. So if you go to Purdue OWL and you look at the headings and serration page, so let me switch to that for a second. You have 5 different levels of headers according to APA. So all of these that we just put in there, all the rubric items that are on the mind map, are level 1 headers. But then we can break those sections up in your mind map into level 2, level 3. There's probably almost definitely no reason to go to level 3, but for you guys, I think level 3 is... Actually, I've been to level 4 before, but I have no idea what level 5 looks like in my own personal experience. But looking at the literature review, here's a good place to do this. So literature review, let me use the example of me working, doing a paper for my grad school stuff. So I'll say literature review. What are the different topics that I need to introduce in the literature review that people might not understand? So let me say... gamification. What's another topic I need to address in the literature review section? Probably grit. Anything else to talk about in the literature review section for my gamification or paper? The term gamification, what grit is. Let me say technology. I don't know. So these would be level 2 headers. They're part of the literature review, but they are subsections. Now, if I wanted to talk more about grit, I could say, what is grit? Another question about the APA paper. Yes, we'll talk about that in a second. The student paper, APA student paper in Purdue OWL. Yes, that's a good example for you to use. So looking at the mind map, stick one more in here for grit. So outcome, we'll say, what does grit mean? So what is it and what does it mean? So hopefully this looks... like it makes sense. and I know it seems kind of, you might not see the benefit there, and I didn't really before, but I I will attest to the fact that it's worth the time to go through and try to map out what your work is here. And it's not just for the literature review. For your innovation description is kind of short, but you might want to map out and say, oh, the surgery that I watched was definitely something I want to talk about. My mentor was really nice and really helpful. I don't know. Innovation description, talk to me about maybe the rough draft part. And so you get the idea. This little mind map will be a very helpful way for you to organize your thoughts. And this really comes into saying, well, here are all my level 1 sections on my paper. Let me pull up a new Google Doc here for you. Here are all the level 1 sections on my paper, and here are all the level 2 sections that I need to put underneath of there, and there are some level 3 headers I need to put in there. So that's a good way for you to look at your paper. Speaking of paper, I have my own options here for my font choices and stuff, but that's not what we need to be working with. If you switch to back to the Purdue OWL, you'll see that you change the alignment and you change the emphasis, so bold or italics or things like that. But it's always Times New Roman 12-point font. So ignoring the title page for now, let's say, so there's abstract. Now abstract has its own special rules for you to look at in Purdue OWL. But I should take this, and another thing that I forgot forever, or never really thought about the benefits of before, is this section here. Instead of having to go in and make all my level 1 headings look like that, I can just use this setting instead of having to go in and change them all. So this is wrong. Montserrat 18 point, that's not how it's supposed to be. So we can switch this to Times New Roman, 12-point font. And if I look back here, it is supposed to be title case heading, bold, and centered. So let me make that centered. And it's supposed to be, as far as line spacing goes, it's supposed to be double, but I do have in here this extra space above, before and after that I need to take out of there. So double. There we go. So I make it once in Google Docs, and then I come down here to heading and say update heading 1 to match. So now when I make my next heading, which is, whoa, that would be incorrect, literature review, I can highlight it and then come up here to say make this a level 1 heading, and it does everything it's supposed to do for me. So definitely use those. Look at the directions here and make your headings and use them over and over again. And then a level 2 header, going back to my MindNode document, I can see gamification is one of my level 2 headers for literature review. So that is all the way up against the left side, which means flush left means no indentation. It is bold and it is title case. It is also Times New Roman 12-point font and double space, just like everything else in the document. So I can highlight this, come down to level 2 heading, and say update level 2 heading to match. And my next level 2 heading is grit. And so if I select level 2, it does all the settings for me. So I don't need to keep showing you that. You can you can extrapolate what the rest of it looks like. But this is the next thing that's super helpful for me writing these papers is after I do that mind map document and have it all planned out, I transfer that to the Google Doc, put everything in where it's supposed to be, including as Parker was asking about. Let me actually go to the page setup. So this should be 1-inch margins everywhere. And then you put in your heading and all that stuff. I don't know why. Maybe because it makes it feel like I've started the project and got it done and I've chipped away at it and it's not this big monumental task anymore. But the first thing I always do with my papers when I was still in grad school and still doing all that stuff was going through and making all this stuff work. Put in your running header the way it's supposed to be. Remember, it's supposed to be different on the first page. And put in your paper, make your title page. Did all that stuff first, and then it became a lot easier to say, oh, well, let me write those 2 paragraphs about gamification, because I'm not writing the paper. I'm just gonna fill in that blank there. But it's the right blank to fill in. I need the blank, so it becomes a very easy to-do list. So that's how I have always thought, or not have always. That's how years of working through having to write APA papers and stuff like that. My solution to that problem is mapping it out in a mind map, and then taking that and making all the headers and putting everything into my document and saving that document, and then just taking time, small chunks of time, do a little Pomodoro session on writing that rough draft of the gamification part. Just get that in there. And then do the next part, and then do the next part, and just chip away at it. It's again, one of those things that's frustratingly effective. I don't know, for some reason I feel in my brain that shouldn't work. It shouldn't be that easy to trick myself into getting the work done, but it works pretty well. I can show you here. I pulled up a mind map that I did for my school law paper instead of just talking about the papers that I did before. So this is, I had to take a class called School Law, and this is the mind map that I made for it. So there were 3 different parts that we had to address, including citing the actual cases and policies, and each argument, each different section of my plan, all that other stuff that I had to do, had different sections, breaking those sections down, planning it out, and then using the different sources here and making sure that I had my, different Supreme Court cases that I was citing and stuff, made that writing this document so much easier. I just sit down and do one of those different sections at a time, and made it super easy. I'm not just telling you to do it because I want you to fill time. I'm telling you to do it because it becomes so much easier once you do. So as far as your assignment, as I shared with you already, as you know about this, the way you know about this live stream, is to say that your document is going to be one of the 2 things, and this was actually new information from this morning, a meeting I was in this morning with capstone people about how seniors are going to demonstrate their work. So your written report is going to be like the bulk of your end of the year deliverables. We've streamlined it down to reduce the amount of work that is on you guys, but this is one particular skill that alumni have so frequently referenced that I fought to keep this to be a thing. This should be a thing that you take seriously. Not that you wouldn't take it seriously, but this is the thing that I chose is probably the thing that's going to help you the most. So take the time, plan out your document. If you want to use a mind map software, is what I find helpful. You can make an outline, whatever. But make your document, plan your document, switch everything over, make sure it's all nice and pretty APA. Word documents, Google Docs, like they're made to make this stuff easy. So use the tools that are in there, like the headings feature and stuff like that I just showed you, to make sure that your document is correct, and then start chipping away at it. What I said I wanted from you by the start of next week, you should have 8 peer-reviewed sources that are things that you will use in your literature review. And you should have a rough draft of your literature review ready to go. This isn't what you're turning into me as like your final product, but you should take the time, have a more than 500 word section of the literature review done, in-text citations, put together your argument there. Set yourself up in your literature review for your innovation to shine through as such a great idea. That's kind of the point of the literature review, is to prepare your project, prepare people to understand how awesome your project is. So make sure your literature review is in a good rough draft state so that we can move forward next week. The other element that you're going to be turning in, and I'll share this information elsewhere as well, not just the end of a YouTube video. The other thing that you are going to be turning in as part of your project is going to be what would have been your final exam. So we're skipping the portfolio and the poster. Current plan is for there to be some type of digital showcase, maybe YouTube live stream, maybe a Microsoft Teams where you're going to do something with that. Not sure yet. We're still talking about how that's gonna come through, but the idea being each one of you is going to take the work that you're going to do in your written report, synthesize it down into a 30 to 60 second video. You don't have to be on camera. You can use Adobe Spark. You can make a PowerPoint that you narrate and flip through slides or whatever. But where we want there to be an example from each student, kind of like what would happen at the capstone, where people would walk up and see you and hear your kind of little elevator pitch, your 30 to 60 second little introduction to your topic. We're going to create that as well. And it's going to be showcased somehow. It might be in a digital video format. It might be posted to a YouTube channel, and we make posts on the Biomed website. I don't know. But here are the 2 major elements that you're going to do to cross the finish line. If you're someone who's interested in learning about the poster process, we'll talk more about that too. But that is not going to be a requirement. That's going to be an optional thing for you to learn, another really important skill for your future STEM career. But as far as how the current plan is for getting across the finish line with the capstone stuff, the poster just doesn't make sense as a way to show your work. It's going to be too hard for anybody to be able to read or understand when you take what's supposed to be a 42-inch wide piece of paper and shrink it down to a small little screen. It just doesn't make sense. So, just going to check my information here. I only got a couple questions. Okay, one more question. Do we have to make the innovation, or are we just doing the paper? So, yes. And again, talk to me, set up a meeting so I can talk to you individually if you need help with your innovation. But yes, it might not, it won't be, it almost definitely can't be everything that you may have wanted it to be. You don't have the time. We had spent so many weeks not working on any of that stuff because of the packets and all that stuff. So you probably can't produce the innovation that you want to produce. But you should have an innovation idea. The more you can do about that, the better. And again, I can talk to you about that so we can make sure that you have the resources you need and you understand what you need. But if you look at the paper, part of the paper, switch to that screen. The innovation description portion of your paper, 500 words of it is about what you made. So if you don't make something, it's going to be really hard to write that. It can just be your plan. It can be, this is what I wanted to make, and here's what I was thinking it would do. But again, talk to me if you don't have your innovation done. I would encourage you to schedule a meeting with me, and if you want to pair up with somebody, the link that I have shared in Google Classroom will allow you to schedule meetings with multiple people and me, so you can pair up with somebody, and if you have the same question and need help with something, and I can help you both at the same time. But your paper should talk about your innovation, and it's okay if your innovation's not finished. If you got things done early, a bunch of people got things done super early and have a total innovation, great, perfect. You'll be able to take a picture of it. You'll be able to show it in your little video or the PowerPoint that you make that's going to be part of your final deliverable. We want to be able to show something there. If it's a finished product, awesome. If it's a prototype, that's okay too. And if it's the seeds of an idea, then we should talk a little bit more about how you can maybe move that closer to being done, so that we can have more to write about and talk about. Because it's going to be to write 500 words is going to be kind of tough if you just have your very first idea that you haven't done anything with. So that looks like the only other question. That was the last question that I have in here. So I'm going to, again, this video is going to be turn into an actual video, so it's going to be on YouTube if you missed it, or if you know someone who missed it and needs this information, you can just send them the link so that they can get it. Make sure you're checking Google Classroom so that you get the deliverables turned in when you need to get them turned in by. And other than that, that's all I have to say. So this is only my second ever live stream, so I hope it went okay. I'm going to try to do it a couple more times so I get better at it. But thanks for sticking by. And we'll talk to you next time. See ya.